Do you need some help?
No. It's cold outside, but you guys decided to join us in the warm here. So listen, this is now, welcome, first of all. This is now our second Christmas that we have been running events and you guys have been attending. And that really means a great deal to all of us at the magazine, to Lydia, to myself, to Tam, to Josh. When we first started, I think we weren't quite sure what it would be like in a crowded marketplace like London, but it's really been extraordinary, I think. Yeah. Really genuinely, and the heart of it is you guys, because you come even when it's cold, and you ask questions, you pay attention, and that really means a great deal to us. So I was hoping we could start in a slightly cheesy way with a little round of applause, if you don't mind. For you guys. Actually, out of interest, how many people here, this is the first time that you guys have attended one of our events? Wow, that's great. That's really great. Thank you, Gilbert. That's really amazing. I think about half. Did you count
looks like
half?
it.
Or?
More.
Amazing. All right, let's get started. I'll introduce the speakers, and then we will get straight into the conversation. But a lot of you, I think, already know our speakers for today. Gilbert Achcar is Professor of Development Studies and International Relations at SOAS. His many books, published in a total of 15 languages and counting, include The Clash of Barbarisms, The Making of the New World Disorder, Perilous Power, The Middle East and U.S. Foreign Policy, co-authored with Noam Chomsky, The People Want, a radical exploration of the Arab uprising, and now, the book we are here to talk about, and which you can purchase at the back from Saki, The New Cold War, the United States, Russia, and China from Kosovo to Ukraine. Isabel Hilton is one of Scotland's most distinguished journalists and the founder and editor of China Dialogue, an independent non-profit organisation based in London, Beijing, and San Francisco. She has enjoyed a long and distinguished career as a foreign correspondent, reporting from China, South Asia, Latin America, Africa. This is the entirety of the globe, the Middle East and Europe.
There are missing bits. Yeah.
We're missing some parts. And has written and presented several documentaries for BBC Radio and television. Gilbert, Isabel, welcome to the Frontline Club.
Here's the book, a whole book called The New Cold War, where you lay out, Gilbert, an argument for how the world has politically realigned since the end of the Soviet Union, becoming not more peaceful, as many were predicting at the time, but rather locked into a new formation or structure of belligerent, antagonistic nation-states with new alliances, new tensions. Now, since Russia invaded Ukraine, which is almost 2 years ago now, those warnings of a new Cold War have become very frequent with that specific phrase. But you yourself used it a long time ago, didn't you, in an article, a long time before this book came out. So can you start by telling us why you came up with the concept? I mean, what was it in particular that you noticed going on in the world that made you think we were entering a new stage of global antagonism? What were you meaning by the new Cold War?
Precisely. This new Cold War differs from the previous one in that it is triangular. And you have these three countries, three major military powers and powers in different senses. And unlike what many people believe, it's not about ideology. The concept first appeared on the eve of the First World War, actually, which wasn't ideological at all. It's about dividing the world between imperial powers. And so this concept referred to the arms race, the build-up of military power, the preparation for war without getting into war. That's the Cold War, the cold phase of war, if you want. And that's indeed what we got in. I mean, the United States maintained in the 90s a very high military budget compared to the promises of peace of the 90s. And then the two countries will go on. I mean, the peace about the new Cold War was 1999, and that was before Vladimir Putin becomes president of Russia, and before the turn of the oil prices that allowed Russia to rearm, to reinvest in its armament, and at the same time China got into also, an increasing trend of military expenditure, while the United States, of course, got to the peaks in military expenditure.
The Kosovo War is a war that you consider to have been pivotal in terms of how the strategy has subsequently manifested itself, and it's something that I want us to come to. But before we come to that, Isabel, I was wondering if we could talk a bit about the rise of China, and in particular whether you think that there was an inevitability to this current clash that we're seeing. As Gilbert was saying, in the 1990s, the relationship between China and the last remaining superpower was very different to the relationship that they currently have. Do you think it was inevitable that a civilization of that size, as it grows, is going to come in conflict? Or do you think there were mischances along the way?
I think there were mischances along the way. I mean, I think, could things have turned out differently? Yes, probably they could. There were several phases in the evolution of internal politics in China where things could have turned out differently. It's not necessarily... I mean, there are clearly kind of irreducible points of contention, Taiwan being one of them. The security, the Eastern Pacific security, I think, is... Or if the United States wished to remain the guarantor of security in that region, there was going to be jockeying. But
Right.
Did it have to get to this point? No, I don't think it necessarily had to get to this point. But when the Chinese talk about security, excuse me, you have to remember what they're talking about. First of all, it's the security of the party as the uncontested power in China. And everything else is, kind of in circles beyond that. So the security of the party,
Right.
the security of the country is, kind of contingent on that. And then how far do you want to take that? So there are all sorts of elements of security which could dictate that China expands its control into the South China Sea, for example. Energy security is a major issue. All sorts of, strategic considerations depending on what assumptions you make about what you're going to face in terms of challenge. And, you get into this security dilemma where one move by one party is overinterpreted by the other party, and so it goes on, and then you end up in a confrontation.
Do you see, Gilbert, a world in which the 1990s happened, the Soviet Union collapses, and the Americans and the Chinese come to some sort of détente? Or is that a world that was just never going to happen?
They were not only in a détente, they were in a kind of alliance before 1990.
Yeah.
Since the 70s, since Kissinger, very much in the news now, from a very, very hostile attitude to China turned into a friendly attitude to China, to the point of even selling weapons or sending weapons to China in its war against Vietnam, actually, in 79. So you had a kind of alliance between the two countries, and that was discarded by the United States, not by China.
That's your interpretation, is it? That it was the United States that...
No, it was clear. I mean, Isabel Hilton just mentioned Taiwan, but the one who broke the agreement on Taiwan is the United States. When Bush Sr., against one more time him here, although Clinton will play an even worse role than that, but he sold weapons, advanced weapons, planes, and all that to Taiwan in an open breach of the agreement with China. The agreement about Taiwan was one of settling kind of peaceful prospects, but you have the one China principle, which the United States adhered to and still adheres to in principle, and the commitment not to station any military presence there, and not to keep selling weapons to Taiwan. And
there's a counter commitment, on the other hand, or at least an assumption that China has repeatedly said that it won't use force, but it reserves the right to, but it would prefer not to. Yeah. So again, we have, on both sides we have an issue. It did
not use force, but when it saw that the United States is doing that, the tension started rising, and when you had an independentist in Taiwan pushing forward, then the Chinese became very nervous. And what happens in '96? Right. China started some gesticulation against the rise of independentism in Taiwan, and Clinton sent to aircraft carrier groups and all that, which was, again, a very provocative gesture, which will lead to this very high tension.
Can I just...
That was the tensest moment in the relation with China since the 50s.
Isabel, you're clearly pushing back a little bit, but can you just backtrack and explain? So you clearly don't think it was as one-sided as Gilbert has just sketched out. Can you explain why?
Because I think that one of the triggers of the change in attitude in China was the one that Gilbert has just referenced, which was, you remember how we got into this situation. So in 1949, when the Kuomintang lost the civil war, they repaired to Taiwan and declared, the Republic of China and regarded it as the rightful ruler of China. And they retained the seat at the United Nations, etc., etc. So all through, the Cold War until the 70s, till the Nixon visit, and eventually in 1979, the restoration of relations between, at least the establishment of relations between the People's Republic and the United States. In the course of that process, from the Nixon visit to relations with the United States, Taiwan loses its seat in the United Nations, but in return it gets the Taiwan Relations Act, in which the United States promises to give Taiwan the means to defend itself. So there we have, that's the situation in the 70s. Then what happens, and this is a dictatorship, the Kuomintang are not a democratic power. There was a major massacre after, before 1949, but in Taiwan by mainland forces. It's not necessarily a kind of warm and friendly one-people relationship. So what happens in Taiwan then is you get, it's prospering, incomes are rising, people want democracy, and they get it in the end of the dictatorship. And so you have political parties contesting different visions of a future for Taiwan, amongst them independentist parties, or at least, self-government parties. And that's when China starts to get extremely nervous, and it's the arrival of democracy. It's the arrival of the notion that the people of Taiwan have a right to determine their own future, and that's what begins to raise the temperature. So I don't think it's one thing. I think these things play against each other. The United States, I can see Yoshibet wants to come back. The United States then, is put in the position of, what do they do? What is their commitment? Would they, and it remains strategic ambivalence in theory, would they go to the defense of Taiwan? A bit. Possibly, but the idea that the doubt remains is part of the defense of Taiwan, because they don't,
okay,
don't know.
Right of reply.
I would just argue that Taiwan is a little closer to China than it is to the United States. I mean, that's, supposed to be by the United States itself part of China, and therefore China,
we can argue the history of Taiwan.
No, it's more normal for China to regard the issue of Taiwan as crucial for itself than for the United States. That's the point. I mean, in the name of what should the United States be the global cop and intervene everywhere in defending so-called democracy, when at the same time it defends dictatorships everywhere.
Gilbert, can I briefly?
That's the point.
Can I briefly play the role of the 9-dash line?
No. But I want to agree.
My point was not that the US has the right to be the cop, but that what made the China nervous was not so much the presence of the United States, but the arrival of democracy in Taiwan.
I agree that that's part of the story, but I don't think that sending aircraft carrier groups to and all that, a big military power there, that gesture by the United States did not at all arrange things, and it's not in the interest of Taiwan or the Taiwanese people. Like Nancy Pelosi's visit recently, that's not in... Glad to hear you say that. That's not in the interest of the Taiwanese. That's the point.
Let's try and talk about what happened in the 90s, because I'm very interested in talking about this trajectory that brings us to the war in Iraq, subsequently the Ukraine war, and even the Gaza war. And that's all the things we want to get to. But I think we have to start with Kosovo, because Kosovo was the beginning of this new global order. So I think we should start there, Gilbert, and just outline why you think that particular intervention was so pivotal And for the audience, for those who don't recall, the Kosovo intervention was 6 years after the Soviet Union collapsed?
No, eight.
It's 99.
99, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's not that the Kosovo War was a major war, that's not the point, but it was a qualitative tipping point after, a culmination, if you want, after a process that went over through the 90s, and where the issue of NATO is central. Because at the end of the Cold War, the United States faced the problem of what to do with NATO.
Yeah.
And you had a very lively, very heated debate at the very top of the US government, at the very top of the US administration, what to do with NATO. And the 2 points of view, if you want, that you had at that, there were no pacifists saying dissolve NATO. You would find this out of the administration, but not in the administration. But in the administration, you had 2 points of view. One was keep NATO as it is, don't do anything more, and try to build different relations with Russia and a new security system in Europe and the rest. And you had the other option, which was enlarge NATO. We have a window of opportunity. Russia is a potential enemy. It's an atavistic imperial country. So we have to, enlarge NATO to the maximum, to the borders of Russia.
Yeah.
And that second option is the one that prevailed during the 90s. And of course, that led to very great resentment in Russia, up to the point when NATO started even intervening even out of its zone, the zone defined by the North Atlantic Treaty.
So you think that it was the expansion of NATO that led to the intervention in Kosovo, rather than the Kosovo intervention giving it a new lease of life?
No, the Kosovo was the illustration of that, the fact that NATO was not being expanded only, but also becoming an organization that was acting militarily, unlike what happened during the whole Cold War, where it never shut a war, shut a bullet.
So, Isabel, keeping on the theme of NATO, there were arguments at the time, weren't there, to actually reduce the budgets and the power of NATO, not just remain the same. And then, as you pointed out, the opposite has happened. But were people trying to find a new role for NATO in the world? In a post-Soviet world, were there discussions about what it was actually for in this post-Cold War period?
There were certainly discussions about what it was for.
Do you agree with Gilbert on that growth leading to Kosovo?
I would defer to Gilbert. This is not really my field, and I've read that section of the book. There is an argument, as you know, about whether NATO expanded or whether states wished to have the umbrella of NATO. And, NATO doesn't force anyone to join. So, again, you get into is this self-determination and legitimate defense? I've just been at an event with several Baltic states, and I can tell you they're extremely pleased to be in NATO.
That's actually worth talking about a little bit, isn't it? Because the way that you've explained it, Gilbert, is that I think perhaps sometimes you give the Americans rather too much agency, that they were expanding in a deliberate direction. But as Isabel points out, a lot of the smaller states were desperate. Not the smaller states, Ukraine as well, desperate to join the umbrella.
Yes.
Yeah.
The point is not here. When you have a club or an alliance, enlarging it, it's your decision. Of course, there are people who will apply to join, but enlarging it, accepting them on board is your decision. And that's the problem here. Of course, the Eastern European states wanted to join NATO because it's a club of rich and powerful countries, in the same way that they want to join the EU, right? But accepting them is a very different matter. The EU doesn't accept any country. Turkey has been knocking on the door of the EU for 4 decades, okay, right? So they don't accept anyone. And the problem here is that precisely you had all the American historians were unanimous on opposing the extension of NATO, explaining that this will antagonize Russia and this will lead to very, very bad consequences, because the Russians will understand that you are expanding NATO without inviting Russia in, and therefore you are still considering Russia, even though communism or whatever you call the system collapsed completely, you are still considering Russia as a potential enemy, and that's exactly what was happening.
What was the discussion you had with Mary Kaldor about this? Because we were talking about new wars and how that fitted into the new Cold War.
Yeah, do you know, I mean, I'm sure many people do. Mary Kaldor came up with the conception of new wars in, I think, 99 as well. Is that when you published Cold War, the new Cold War for the first time? And her examples were similar, although actually the one where she really noticed that things were changing was the Bosnia-Herzegovina conflicts, but then Kosovo fitted her analysis as well. And she said that she made the arguments that the wars of the 80s and 90s could only be understood in the context of a globalized, interconnected world, and they were less likely they were going to be more about identity politics, which we've seen come to pass, many more non-state actors we have seen come to pass, and she conceptualized this through a lot of the Yugoslav conflict and Yugoslavia falling apart. Were you aware of her work at the time?
No, of course,
Yes.
but it's completely different. New wars, her concept of new wars is about those ethnic and all those conflicts that you had that developed, and the Balkan was very central to that. I'm not dealing with that. I'm dealing with the global configuration.
But it's got
of power.
similar dynamics. No, we have to. When you're looking at how nation states form treaties or alliances, you're also looking at these other aspects of politics, including identity politics, because people do start then acting for ideological reasons.
Of course, there are plenty of issues related to that. But again, this is not at all my focus. My focus is on the international relation between those three powers. I mean, the West, led by the United States, China and Russia, and the alliance of convenience that was built since the 90s, actually, that started in the 90s, especially for the events that we mentioned that pushed China to collaborate with Russia, its former brother enemy, if you want. And that's this dynamics that is not a matter of identity or whatever. It's a very classical case of geopolitical Machtpolitik, if you want, power politics.
Yeah, but Russia and China had lowered the hostility in the 80s. It wasn't, after all, Gorbachev was visiting China in 1989, famously.
That was just at the very end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Yes, because the year after it collapsed.
Indeed, but what I'm saying is that that the rapprochement wasn't so much pushed by the United States. The United States didn't push China into the arms of
its
neighbor.
Its military attitude towards China pushed China to collaborate. I mean, you have the detailed history of that. China started buying weapons from Russia in the 90s.
Well, because there was an embargo from the European Union, for example, after Tiananmen.
And it felt a need to get sophisticated weapons with what it felt as an increasing American threat, and therefore started buying those weapons. And Russia was only very happy to sell for economic reasons, obviously. Yeah. I mean, the two major export products that Russians have are oil and gas
and weapons.
And weapons. Yeah.
Well, then, maybe we want to get onto Ukraine, of course, but it feels difficult to talk about Ukraine now without talking about the trajectory, starting from Kosovo, as you've explained, was a turning point of sorts, and where that world order went, that new world order. Because from the point of view of the West and from the point of view of Kosovo, that intervention was a massive success. And actually, it led directly, that sense of success led directly to the disaster in Iraq, because we had the confidence to intervene. And the Iraq war caused an enormous amount of different realignments, which is possibly too complicated to get into. But do you think that's a reasonable arc to say we had the Kosovo conflict, which gave this idea of a new world order where interventions could happen on humanitarian grounds and be a success, and then that led to greater confidence until Iraq?
Well, first of all, I would disagree with the fact that Kosovo was a success. It's I mean, look at the situation there. It's really messy now, completely messy.
But
So
Gilbert,
Well,
look at the situation then.
Yeah.
So-
I mean, there
look at the
wasn't.
situation then, but look at what happened then. And what happened is the Russians, Boris Yeltsin, offered the Americans a clear solution to what was happening. He had influence over Milosevic for obvious reasons. And the American ambassador in Moscow cabled Washington saying about that. And they ignored that because Madeleine Albright and Clinton and all that were very keen on having NATO get into NATO into a war for the 50th anniversary of NATO, actually, in 49, and for the symbol it means for the expansion of the U.S. Role in Europe. And that's why I'm saying it got a mess. I mean, that of course there was you're right that there was a civil war going on there, but there was the way to fix it without this war, and it was shunned, it was ignored by the United States, and it went into this war, and look at the result. The result,
Well,
I mean, it's
yeah.
still very tense there.
More than tense, I think. I mean, yeah. But yeah, I mean, then you see that at least the perception, as Lydia says, of the success of Kosovo carried on until Iraq. I mean, people in the West believed that that was a way of using Western power up until the Iraq War. You wouldn't disagree with that analysis of it.
Which people? Who believed that? I mean how many people believed that the invasion of Iraq was something good? I mean, you had a mass opposition to the invasion of Iraq, including in this country, even though this country was a major participant. No, it was clear for everyone that these wars were not for humanitarian reasons, as they claimed. I mean, I think for a big part of the public opinion, not everyone, of course, but for a big part of the public opinion, understood that wasn't the case. And not many people were fooled by the arguments given for the invasion of Iraq. But the invasion of Iraq, you're right to point to it, is the next major war, and at a larger scale, when the United States goes on unilateral, ignores the Security Council, and this time not only Russia and China, but even France. I mean, one of the the power of holding veto power, even France was opposed to that war, and Germany too, but Germany has no permanent seat at the UN. So that's the issue. I mean, that was a confirmation in the eyes of Moscow and Beijing of the fact that the United States is a bullying power that wants to play it unilateral, circumvent the international institutions, circumvent the UN Security Council, and therefore, since things are like this, I mean, that's one of the major arguments of Vladimir Putin.
And we'll come to that, yeah absolutely, because I want to come to that with Ukraine.
Lessons when you invaded Iraq. So, I mean,
But Isabel,
my invasion of Ukraine is nothing compared to that.
But Isabel, do you think
his kind of argument?
Do you think that message was heard in Beijing at the time? Do you think that that's the message they took away from the invasion of Iraq?
I think it's hard to avoid the message of full spectrum dominance, which is what was discussed in Washington at the time. And it was the moment of maximum hubris, I think, of American power. And was clearly going to be. I mean, it was pretty obvious that this was going to be a mess even before they did it. So, yes, I think that obviously that message would have been heard in Beijing. Whether they then thought it applied to them, I don't know. I mean, it's
very different.
Not the same thing, yeah.
It's one thing to attack Iraq, it's another thing to try and take on China.
Yes, quite. And actually at the time, you know, things in China was getting massive FDI. It was, you know, being encouraged to, you know, it had the globalization boom, or American investment was pouring in. It didn't seem like a kind of threatening situation in Beijing. And, you know, it was being encouraged to join the WTO, all of that, you know, the making of today's China was going on as a kind of warm cooperation.
Let's get to Ukraine.
It's not,
because we're running out of time.
It's not one-dimensional, is what I'm saying.
It's more a strategic choice by China. And that's what they called at the time the peaceful rise. They understood that they need to build their economic power. And in order to build the economic power, they needed to be rather peaceful in international relations and to have good relations with Western countries, and especially the United States.
But Gilbert, that's why I asked.
That's what they did over these years, while at the same time maintaining their military build-up at a much lower level than that of the United States, but still, right? And trying to and until now, even now, you see China, the way China, for instance, celebrated Kissinger now after his death, the way they keep blaming the United States for bullying them instead of having good relations as they wish for, because they know that it's in their economic interest.
But Gilbert, the reason I asked
and why their economic interest is important, because it's the major legitimation of the Communist Party rule is economic success.
Yes.
The reason I asked Isabel the question about Iraq is because, for example, a country on the scale of China could have taken two messages from the Iraq war. They could have taken the message which you appear to believe they did, which is that it is better to what they called hide and bide, that you wait it out, you build up your power in secret. Or you could have taken the message which it appears Putin and the Russians took, which is that you have to make sure that there is no way that the Western alliance can come for you. Those are two separate messages.
Even Russia did the same at that point, because it was also still building up, and the turning point will be for Vladimir Putin around the very famous Munich speech, 2007. Before that, 2004, he goes to Germany, he gives speeches on. Russia absorbed a number of things, including the expansion of NATO to the Baltic republics, which was very hard to swallow for the Russians, because these are former Soviet republics. They are not.
That's why they want to be in NATO.
That's why. Well, that brings us to Ukraine.
Let's get to Ukraine. Just finish your point. Oh, do you want to come in, Elizabeth?
I do want to.
Gilbert, finish your point, and then let's get to Ukraine, because I know the audience.
Gilbert has details and with wonderful research and wonderful narrative, this sort of the international relations of this and the strategic thinking of this. What I feel is perhaps missing in this conversation is going back to agency in domestic politics. When I look at China and you see the evolution of the relationship of the regime to the people, these are also very powerful drivers of the international position. And going back to my point, that when China talks about security, it starts with the security of the party. What does that rest on? From after 1989 to about 2008, 2009, it rested on performance legitimacy. After 1989, essentially the regime said to the people, stay out of politics, we will make you rich. And they did. They went for GDP growth above everything else, above every other consideration. What mattered was GDP growth. But of course, that catch-up phase runs out of steam at a certain point. And what is your message to people when GDP is at struggling 2%, 3%? It becomes Xi Jinping's message of making China great again. Everything bad that happens is the fault of the foreigner, and that has locked China into a nationalism and a confrontation with the United States. So, yes, all of these, strategic decisions were happening in capitals, but I think you have to take into account the politics of the country and what that makes governments do.
Yeah, and that nationalism is growing all over the world in different ways, obviously.
And it locks people into positions that they can't resolve from.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get to the audience, because I can feel the audience itching. Where do we have we have Josh with the microphone. So, should we take a couple of questions, 2, 3 at a time, and see how we go?
Hi, thank you for that. I agree that, Kosovo might have been the point where militaristically the bipolar world after the Cold War changed into this triangular structure. But if you think about it, going back to what other people said around economic conflict, not purely militaristic conflict, or just economic friction, would you say that's maybe a bit later, coming to the financial crisis, that there was actually that split? And today, we have you spoke about India, but there's also the GCC, there's ASEAN. There are states, when you measure it in a not purely militaristic term, have a lot of power. And you could make the argument that geopolitically today, economic conflict or economic might is more important than militaristic might, despite the fact that we see military conflicts today.
good question. We'll come to it. And then the lady?
Regarding Kosovo, do you not think part of the intervention was not because they'd suddenly decided NATO was going to be pushy, was because of what was regarded as the failure of what happened during the Bosnian War? And, you were right, that I think the roots are in that. So that was part of the reason. And NATO may not have been firing bullets in the Bosnian War, but they were certainly flying around towards the end. But, part of the reason for that intervention, I thought, at the time, was because of this abject failure to prevent the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia.
Good, thank you. You're nodding, Isabel. Do you want to come in on that?
No, I agree. Certainly the conversation in the discussion in the European Union was about that frustration and quite a lot of enthusiasm for the American intervention in Europe. And we haven't really talked about Europe very much in this, which is another rather large element in the world. And, the stabilization of Eastern Europe, former Eastern Europe, after the wall came down, was just a massive achievement. There were very few conflicts, Yugoslavia being an exception. But, the Czech Republic and Slovakia managed to split entirely peacefully. All kinds of things didn't happen that might have happened had it not been for the European Union expanding eastwards. And I think that's another factor that we need to acknowledge. It wasn't just that, warmongers came out of the woodwork and lots of other things happened.
We got one here, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was a very fascinating, shall we say, debate between Isabel and Gilbert on what explains, in terms of international relations theory, how we got to Ukraine. And for me, it was almost like listening to a debate between a realist and a liberal IR theorist. The difference between great power politics and the power of ideas, the struggle of ideas. So just to fast forward to what is currently happening now in the conflict in Gaza, what best explains what is happening now? And specifically, what I would like to ask is the unconditional support of the United States and its allies to Israel in what is happening in Gaza. Is it a great power struggle between, say, the West and the global South? Or is it a struggle over ideas, over identity, over race? What best explains this unconditional and I would say unprecedented support for what many believe is really genocide and certainly war crimes that is happening in Gaza?
Good. Thank you. And who else? Lydia, choose. That lady at the back, I think.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would like to add a short bit to that excellent question, and that is, can you also tell us about the role of the Arab countries, in particular the Gulf countries, when it comes to the current crisis in Gaza and the support for Palestinians? Where are the Arab world leaders really standing on this issue and their support for the Palestinians?
Good, thank you. And do we have another one?
Gilbert raises a tantalizing counterfactual, or proposes a tantalizing counterfactual of non-NATO expansion followed by economic aid to Russia, a kind of Marshall Plan. Western economic aid had a tendency of evaporating when it went into the former Soviet Union, there was a great propaganda of enmity against the West throughout the whole Soviet period. So I wonder if you would flesh out this counterfactual a bit more.
Okay. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with that counterfactual briefly, or would you like to go to the Gaza question?
I can start with this and go to the rest. Yeah. Look, in history, you have never guarantees about the outcome, okay? But you try the good path, and then if it fails, you draw other conclusions. But that wasn't what was tried. So you say aid was evaporating. Well, I would invite you to read a book by Janine Wedel, who testified to the U.S. Congress about that, on the role of the West in the corruption, in the terrible corruption that you had in Eastern Europe, not only in Russia, during the 90s, with the kind of aid and the way it was administered and managed. So this is a whole system. Little aid, but managing and encouraging this very corrupt plunder of Russia and other countries that happened. No, if you look at the record, it is terrible. Now, the issue is here is why am I criticizing the United States? Well, because it is, and especially in the 90s, it was the unipolar moment, if you want. It was by far the most important power on earth. It was very conscious of the fact that it was in a position to shape the world. That's exactly the formula that they used in the Pentagon and in the National Security Agency in all their documents, shaping the world. And they shaped the world in the worst possible manner, which got us where we are, right? That's the point.
All right.
Gaza, thank you for bringing in the Israel issue, right? And that's while you will understand that in the Arab world there is zero sympathy for the United States, even for, I mean, people, although people, saw that Russia was invading Ukraine, but they were not convinced by the United States' position in that, because they can't be convinced of anything the United States does in the name of either democracy or sovereignty of other countries and all that, when the United States has been not only invading Iraq, of course, but has been in some way accepting the occupation of the rest of Palestine since 1967 until now, and funding the Israeli state at the level of close to $4 billion every year. And now you see the Gaza war. In 1 month, they killed as many civilians as Russians have killed in Ukraine since February 22. In 1 month, as many children killed as people as children in all the wars in 1 year of 22. So when you see all that, and you see the United States supporting unconditionally to the point of refusing even to call for a ceasefire, any pretense of democracy and human rights and all that coming from the West is absolutely falling on deaf ears. No one will listen to that. They know these are lies.
I mean, the children's statistic is pretty damning, actually. I hadn't heard it phrased like that. It's quite frightening.
Which one?
About all the children, all theatres.
We'll come to the New York Times, a big
we'll come to Tara's question about the Arabs.
First of all, you should say that the Arab states are in some way also accomplice in what is happening, because they are not doing what they could do to exert maximum pressure on the United States and the rest in order to stop that. In 1973, which is what Hamas tried to evoke by choosing the date of the October War, and the 50th anniversary of the October War, the 1973 October War between Israel and the Arab states. In 1973, they declared the Arab exporters of oil and gas declared a boycott of all states supporting Israel. Well, they should have done the same this time, but as you can see, they are not at all in that business. I mean, Egypt is intervening. They have these discussions in Qatar with the chief of the Egyptian intelligence, the chief of Mossad, the chief of the CIA. They are all in Qatar discussing. And the Arab states are trying to get to some kind of scenario to end the war. And what they are floating is an idea inspired by what happened in Lebanon, which is my country, by the way, in 1982, when you had the siege of Beirut and the evacuation of the PLO fighters and leaders from Beirut by sea. So they are trying to float, some kind of scenario of this kind, evacuation of Hamas fighters and leaders. But I don't see any sign of the Israelis accepting that, let alone Hamas, but that's a different story. But the Israelis are really, I mean, the Israeli far right, which is now at the helm in Israel, is seizing this opportunity of October 7 to really reoccupy Gaza, destroy it, and empty it of its people, displace them. A second Nakba, as the Palestinians say, a second major displacement.
Some Israelis say it as well.
Sorry?
Some Israelis have been saying it as well.
Yes, exactly.
Let's have one more round of questions, and then I think we'll draw it to a close. Gentleman over here.
So mine's a very quick question. Do you think this war in Gaza that we've seen is reinforcing the trend that you're describing of Russia and China coming closer together? Or do you think this is not going to have such a big impact 10, 15 years down the line?
Very nice. And the lady?
I want to draw back the attention to Chinese economy effect on the globe, if you call it the new Cold War era, and how do you see the rise of China? What kind of card they play to contest the ideology of the superpower of America? Maybe that's two questions.
It's a fascinating question, I think, for Isabel. Let's have Nick and then Isa.
My question is about the role that you think American duplicity plays for American policymakers, and whether the kind of values that I think we can all agree are often not adhered to are in some sense liberating in terms of foreign policy, as in they give, they allow in the mind of Americans the ability to kind of intervene, or whether they're actually constraining.
Very interesting. And then the gentleman at the back with the glasses.
Thank you very much. What I have to say is a remark rather than a question. As someone that comes from Kosovo and now serves in the diplomatic service of Kosovo, I would like to say something very important, because the humanitarian intervention in Kosovo has been discussed much tonight. To us as Kosovars, we see the intervention as a point of emancipation for us, which prevented the complete annihilation of a majority Muslim ethnic Albanian population. And however our politics are about the intervention, one thing is for certain is that it is a success in stopping ethnic cleansing that had not been seen since the Second World War.
Thank you. All right, which ones do you want to start? Isabel, do you feel like starting with the China one, or is that rather big?
Let's
start with that, because that's really an intriguing one. It seems to combine some elements that we've discussed with the economy.
Belt and Road and how China contests superpower ideology in the US is roughly the question. Yeah. And they do go together. Like a lot of things China did, again, it was driven largely by internal conditions and borrowed ideas. Most of the things China's done have been borrowed ideas. Belt and Road was a borrowed idea from Japan in the mid-90s. Japan having got to the point of, how do you grow your economy? You pour a lot of concrete. There comes a point when you've poured too much concrete at home, but you have massive overcapacity. So what Japan came up with in the mid-90s was the idea that they should build infrastructure, which they were very good at, across Asia, that would buy influence. They would set up a bank to finance it. So that would be kind of creating a political, economic realm. The problem Japan had was that they were much better at the due diligence. So in terms of financing, it had to work. And a lot of these projects don't work. So in 2013, China was pretty much at the same point. Xi Jinping announces in Kazakhstan that, Belt and Road, it went through many changes of name, but it's essentially the same model. So China would finance the building of infrastructure across the world. The road bit, by the way, is ports, confusingly. Yeah. So they're building ports across the Pacific, which is a whole other security issue we could digress onto. But let's stick to the land-based stuff, which is largely infrastructure, largely Asia to Europe kind of stuff. But, about 160 countries formally joined Belt and Road. And for around 4 or 5 years, there were a lot of animal high spirits, a lot of investment. And then if you look at the a lot of it was, by the way, in fossil-heavy energy projects, building coal-fired. They were practically the last country to build big coal-fired power stations at a time when that wasn't a good idea. But if you look at the investment in the Belt and Road, it peaks around 2017, 2018, and then it starts to go down. Why? Because they didn't do the due diligence, because a lot of countries couldn't pay back. China finances it, but it doesn't pay for it, so countries have to pay it back. The combination of the financial crisis and then COVID, a lot of these countries are in debt distress. There is a claim that China did this deliberately. I don't think they created debt distress deliberately, but the fact is they are now managing debt in a lot of those host countries for projects which, didn't yield a return that was promised.
And Isabel, what do you think of the lady's question about how that allows the Chinese to oppose the Americans. Because the American
coming to that.
Yeah,
so you have 160 countries in Belt and Road. China's probably the biggest trade partner of those. You have a close economic relationship. At the same time, China is morphing Belt and Road. We've just had the 10th anniversary into a whole set of other propositions, which are GDI, GCI, GSI. If you haven't heard of those, look them up. So it's Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and now Global Cultural Initiative. And this is the proposition, this is the Chinese proposition to the world, which is we are not a hegemonic superpower, we are nice and peaceful, and the current world order is undemocratic. We are on your side. We are offering an alternative development model, which is essentially authoritarian capitalism of the kind that's practiced in China. What China doesn't want to do is be the world's policeman a la United States, but it does want to thwart and frustrate the United States where it can. And this alternative proposition is part of the mechanism by which it does it. So they sort of go together. The Belt and Road project has kind of run out of steam. It's not, there isn't much money anymore. China's got big economic worries at home. But there's still a proposition. There's an alternative world order which is slowly being built as a kind of shadow world order to the one that exists. And there are a whole series of minilateral and multilateral organizations that China has built in the last 10 years, which operate in parallel to the world order that we've had since 1945.
Do you want to answer the question about Gaza, Gilbert?
Yeah, I mean, quickly... The only country that is shifting its attitude towards this, what's happening, is Russia. And the reason is the Ukraine war and the fact that due to the Ukraine war, Russia had to develop its links with Iran and has got into some kind of, military cooperation with Iran. And that's why Russia welcomed this Hamas delegation after October 7 and has a different attitude towards that, even different from that of China, actually. China is asking the United States to intervene more decisively in exerting pressure on Israel, which is not Russia's kind of attitude, of course. So that's how it plays. It doesn't play in the traditional, if you want. It's not like when you had the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union would back the Arab side and the United States would back the Israeli side. Today, China has, the Arab country with which China has best relations is the Saudi Kingdom. Economic relations. So that's.
And then perhaps you saved the best for last with Nick's question about American duplicity, which I imagine you have quite a lot to say about.
Yep.
Just phrase it one more time. Is it that you believe that the duplicity allows politicians some political cover?
It's a question about whether you think what it gets them, basically, and whether the idea of value promotion and sort of standing by democratic values, even if we believe that is often cynically employed, whether it's actually constraining American action in the kind of official mind or licensing.
No, that has been traditionally what was called famously by Joseph Nye soft power, this distinction between hard power and soft power, which is a very old idea that ideology is also a factor in power. And the United States very much used that ideology of human rights, democracy, and all that globally, but with variable, with a lot of standards, not only two, very different standards. So at the same time that the United States would have very close relations with a country like the Saudi Kingdom, which is, as I said, the most undemocratic, which is the most undemocratic state on earth. On the other hand, it would, towards the Eastern Europe or whatever, against the Soviet Union, play the democratic and human rights card. So that's part of the game. But precisely, we shouldn't be fooled by that when we know how it is. And that's why, any attempt to depict, for instance, the present conflict between Ukraine, around Ukraine, between the West and Russia, as one between democracy and authoritarianism is something I can't buy because it doesn't fit. Kosovo, of course, I mean, Milosevic, I would
Gilbert,
completely agree with you.
I want to draw it to a conclusion.
Kosovo. But my point is precisely there was a different way to solve the Kosovo issue, which would have been better for Kosovo. And by the way, the first foreign edition of my book is Albanian.
Oh, well, that's a great note to end on. Isabel,
Actually, I just want to say one thing.
One final comment from
without
Isabel.
getting into whataboutism in any way, that there is enough hypocrisy to go round all over. So states that state their principles, so the Saudi Arabia, for example, wouldn't claim to be a democracy, but it claims to defend the Ummah. I haven't heard Saudi Arabia or any of the Organization of Islamic States say a word about what's happened to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who are part of the Ummah. Nothing.
Sure.
So,
Absolutely.
hypocrisy...
And I've written about that for the first to write about that in Arabic.
It's not the prerogative of the United States. In China, you cited China making the point about territorial integrity, but China then went on to give Russia all the cover it needed, diplomatic, financial, and technological cover.
I fully disagree with this. I think this is
to be continued.
This is contradictory with the real record.
So we are out of time, and I just want to say thank you all for coming out tonight and throughout the year. If this is your first time, please do sign up to the mailing list and come again. Books available at the back if you want to see what all the disagreement was about. It's all in the Saki book at the back. I want to say thank you to the whole New Lines team for all the events work this year, Faisal, Tam, Josh, and thank you, of course, to Gilbert and Isabel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful.
No.